On today's episode of Inwardly Digest, we're going to talk about whether flesh and blood can inherit the kingdom of God. In 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul makes this statement, what I am saying, brothers and sisters, is this: flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the perishable. So what does that mean? If Jesus' resurrection is physical, why does Paul say this? What does it mean to say flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven? Is Jesus' body physical or was it not? Did he have flesh or did he not? Did he have blood running through his veins or did he not? Which one is it? A couple of things about this passage in 1 Corinthians. First one is that this does happen into an entire context where Paul is talking about the resurrected body. For most of the purposes of these videos, I'm going to quote from the NRSV translation, but I actually very much disagree with the translation here. Throughout chapter 15, the text constantly uses the word physical. It says, for instance, Paul makes a distinction between the physical body and the spiritual body. I think that translation is misguided. The Greek word used here that is translated physical, and other translations, most other translations, says natural. I think that is a better way of translating this in this passage, that Paul is making a distinction between natural and spiritual, not physical and spiritual. Earlier in Paul's same letter to the Corinthians, chapter 2, verse 14, and the NRSV uses the word unspiritual here, but he says, "Those who are unspiritual do not receive the gifts of God's Spirit, for they are foolishness to them, and they are unable to understand them, because they are spiritually discerned. Those who are spiritual discern all things," verse 15, "and they are themselves subject to no one else's scrutiny." Well, the word here that the NRSV translated unspiritual, actually, that's a little bit of a dynamic translation, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with dynamic translation. But it actually is natural man, okay? Uses the same word here, natural. So fuxikos anthropos, all right? And for those of you watching, you can, by all means, you're welcome to critique my Greek pronunciation. I learned in seminary to translate. I didn't learn to speak it. But it uses very literally natural man. And that word natural is the same one in 1 Corinthians 15 that Paul contrasts again with spirit. He's obviously not saying, well, there are these people that have a physical body, and then there are us who do not have a physical body. No, of course they all have physical bodies. The contrast is their focus. Right? They are either focused on and living by the Spirit, or they're living by natural inclinations. So the first thing about 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is to remember that that is the context of Paul's contrast between natural and spiritual. Or NRSV says physical. Again, that's why I think it is a bad translation here. I think it should be natural, like most translations have, natural and spiritual, not a contrast between the physical world and the spiritual world. So what then does it mean then to say flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God? Well, very often in the Bible there are figures of speech, idioms. And this, I believe, is a figure of speech, and I believe I can demonstrate this. And the first way I'm going to demonstrate, I'm going to start kind of back at the beginning, and I'm going to move forward a little bit, but is by turning to a book. It's in the Apocrypha, which in our church is a part of our Bibles. Something for another video. But I'm turning to the Apocrypha at least to show how the phrase, how this figure of speech, flesh and blood, was used at the time of Jesus. Okay, you understand, even if you would not consider Sirach to be part of the Bible, it helps us understand the way language was used, if this was a figure of speech or not. So, I'm going to turn to the book of Sirach. And in Sirach, chapter 14, beginning at verse 17, says, "All living beings become old like a garment. For the decree from old is, you must die. like leaves abundant on a spreading tree, that sheds some and puts forth others. So are the generations of flesh and blood. One dies and another is born. And again in the book of Sirach, chapter 17, verse 30, for not everything is within human capability, since human beings are not immortal. What is brighter than the sun, yet it can be eclipsed? So flesh and blood devise evil. He marvels the host of the height of heavens, but all human beings are dust and ashes. So already in the book of Sirach, we see flesh and blood is being used not to describe physicality, not to describe material reality, but the fact that human beings are limited, that we are temporary, that we are mortal, that we die, that things decay, the world decays, and is subject to death. That's the key, subject to death. Not just Sirach, but also Jesus uses this phrase this way. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 17, Peter had just confessed who Jesus is as the Messiah and the Son of God. And Jesus says to Peter, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." Now the point of this is not Jesus is saying, "Blessed are you, Peter, for the physical world did not show this to you, a physical body." That's not Jesus' point. Jesus' point is to contrast the limit and decay of humanity, okay? The fact that we are born in a world of death, subject to decay, subject to many limitations. And it didn't come from that reality, from the reality we experience as human beings, but came from God. All right? Book of Hebrews, same thing. In Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 through 15, says, "Since therefore," and it's talking about Jesus coming to save humanity, God becoming a human being, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death." Now, certainly God became a human being. God became a physical body. But the point here is not the material world is bad, not that salvation is an escape from our bodies. Salvation is not an escape from our bodies, but a redemption of our bodies. The point is that humanity, that this world is subject to decay and death, and Jesus became that to save it and free humanity from that fate. So the point of flesh and blood, in fact, this is why 1 Corinthians 15, verse 50, he says, "Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable." The point, Paul's whole point in chapter 15 is contrasting perishability, limitness, decay, the world as we experience it that is subject to those things, subject to decay, subject to limitations, subject to death, subject to being perishable, with that which is not perishable, the life that comes from God, the imperishability, being guided by. Paul is not contrasting being made of flesh with made of spirit. This is what is energizing it. This is its status. And this is the important point, because Paul will also make a really important statement in Romans chapter 8, verse 23. He says, "Not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly, while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies." And that's an important point. The Bible talks about our bodies being redeemed, not just our souls. I'm going to need to double check this. I don't think redemption of our souls, I don't think that phrase appears in the Bible. I'm not sure. I'm going to double check. But redemption of our bodies does. God is in the body saving business. God is going to save his creation. Grace perfects nature, it doesn't destroy it. God is out not to make us into ghosts without flesh and bone, but to raise us from the dead as Jesus was, not as a spirit, but having flesh and bone. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, not because the physical world is bad, but because we experience a life subject to decay, subject to death. That's what we're being freed from. We remain human beings, but that corruption is removed. We are empowered by the Spirit to live for God perfectly. And that's what Paul is getting at. Not some kind of semi-Gnostic save us from the physical world, escape from the body, but to be redeemed in the body and to be driven and empowered by the Spirit, not by the natural experience of things, of death and decay, but by finding full life, physical, resurrected life in Jesus Christ, who himself was raised from the dead. So I hope this video was helpful to you. Please like the video and subscribe, and check out the other videos we have on here and we'll continue to have on the Bible, theology, and other guided devotions. And I'll see you next time on Inwardly Digest. God bless and thank you.